Now, this product showed up, and first it was called reflection-free RF, and then it was called Optium, and I've never heard anyone call it Opium, but I've had lots of people call it Optimum. And today I was talking, a scientist I was talking with today who was testing some of it kept referring to Optimum glass. And I'm sorry, guys, but that's the case. It's we know it's Optium, and it's not. I mean, it is Optimum, or it's not. It's Optium. So I couldn't resist. Sorry, I had to put that in. Now we're going to move on to one other property. Actually, we're going to wait. I'll leave that up. But I wanted to show you a sample which will be here for everyone to see. This, it may actually be that if I hold it properly, you may see the reflections. Does it do anything? I have no idea, of course. This way, all right. There you go. All right. So what we have on the left here is Acrylic OP3. We have Luxar laminated 4 millimeter in the middle, in the left center. This is Optium Museum acrylic, the old version, so-called, the one that is no longer going to be, and the new one here. And the difference is quite startling and good, and you can see for yourself when it's over here. We were very pleased to see it. This is a Man Ray that we cut up and reassembled in 4 pieces. He probably wouldn't have minded too much. Another topic that Brian Olson and Carolyn Hay and Chad and other staff there and I discussed at TrueView was the question of defects. And it's interesting to think about how challenging it is, because Cyro, by the way, as you probably know, the Optium materials, all of them, are based on Cyro products. These are Cyro Acrylic, which is something that is good news. It was good news when I learned it some time ago, because that's what we use as well, and we consider Cyro entirely reliable. So they get the acrylite product that has a hard coat on it, an abrasion-resistant coat. That's the basis, and then then TrueView puts the coating on top of that that's anti-reflectant. So you have possible defects in the acrylite, and years ago we had discussions, 20 years ago, many, with Cyro about their standards. I remember well saying, your acrylic is defective. And the technical guy in Maine said, no, it's not. I said, yes, it is. The glass we get is so much better. We have occlusions and all kinds of stuff in acrylite that we never seen anything like it in glass. He said, well, it meets our specification. And the light dawned. I thought, well, what's your specification? And it was a specification essentially that came from an architectural environment. And we were using it in much more intimate circumstances. And a rule of thumb that I have heard again and again is that 6 foot, anything you can't see from 6 feet, was acceptable in the old standard. They had actual, what we call the spec, which was how many inclusions of char, this little black stuff that would get in there per 16 square feet, and of what size, and there was a specification for that. But the main thing was, if you couldn't see it at 6 feet, it was acceptable. And they tightened it up, and we pushed them hard to do it 20 years or so ago to twice as rigorous as it had been. The idea was that at 3 feet, you shouldn't be able to see any of the defects, so-called defects. So there's the underlying substrate itself. Then there's the hard coat. And as Brian pointed out, it can have little bubbles or inclusions in it. And then there's the coat that TrueView applies. So there's 3 opportunities for defects, if you will. And so we looked at, now again, I hope you guys in back can see this. This is a gauge, a TrueView measurement gauge that was given me. You can't see it in back. Well, it shows the size of little circles. So you can, of course, it's out of scale, but and I won't go into refined detail. But the issue is that there is a clear intent to keep it as pure as possible. It's impossible to achieve it. And I felt that when we were talking, it was like, well, up to, let us say, under a 1/16 of an inch, if there's a void, for instance, in the anti-reflective coating, we do our very best to move the glazing around to find a place where it's invisible, and usually we succeed. We reject ultimately very little of it. Now I'm going to digress just a little bit to talk about aging properties of acrylic, and this is a not exactly an Optium related issue, because Optium doesn't, TrueView doesn't make the acrylic, Cyro does. Cyro produced this sheet, and I will have this over here too. It's utterly illegible to anybody who's not in the front row, and maybe even for you. But the point is that they've done Accelerator. They hired a independent party to do accelerated aging tests of OP2. And their tests demonstrate no diminishment whatsoever in the UV protective property of OP2. And this is persuasive, but I'm someone who's always been skeptical of accelerated aging tests. So persuasive but not convincing, let's say. We gathered together a number of pieces, about a dozen pieces of art work that we framed in the early 80s, generally about 25 or a few more years ago than that, 25 years or more, all of which have been hung, some of them with very heavy light loads. And the list here at the top, these are all then Roman Haas products, UF3, most of it 1/8 inch UF3. We tested this with an LSEC 764 light monitor outside, where the unfiltered light level, the unfiltered UV portion of the light was about 760 microwatts per lumen, very heavy. This material all tested between 11 and 14 microwatts per lumen, which is very good. Generally speaking, or at least the standard used to be in museums and other institutions, that below 75 microwatts per lumen was acceptable. I think in many places that's been lowered to as low as 25, but in any case, this is half that. So it was very impressive. This glass was acrylic was all 25 years old. Some was from my home, and it was in sunlight for 365 days a year for over 20 years. So I'm impressed. We also tested a bunch of new material, which is at the bottom of this chart, OP3, just a bunch of material we had in the shop, scraps, little samples, and including, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's see. Including Optium Museum acrylic, which tested extremely low, 5 and 6 microwatts per lumen in the same outdoor circumstance. The Optium acrylic tested in the 300 range, and which calls into question, to my mind, I would say, this is a limited test, by the way, using a UV monitor. It's different from what's the machine used? Thank you. That gives you a full wave. A curve, thank you. Here we go, there's one.